Hello everyone, welcome to JS Gigs and my name is Deepak. Here in this tutorial I'm going to be talking about deferrable views, which is something that was released in Angular. So if you look at my diagram earlier, that we have already spoken about zoneless change detection in the last tutorial, and this time around we are going to be talking about deferrable views, right? So in their release of Angular 18, they specifically spoke about deferrable views, and then we will try to see how it functions, and we'll also see what benefits do they bring to the table, right? So that's something which is to expect in this tutorial. Before I start talking about deferrable views, I also want to talk about like how things that we need to do exactly in this tutorial, right? So let me go to the Miro, and here we're going to be covering the deferrable views. So let me just highlight this with, let's say, green color. And now in the deferrable views, so what is that we're going to be doing is let's just put this here, right? So firstly, we are going to be creating a component. And once we create the component, this component will have a list of students, right? And those images we will load them gradually, right? That's first thing. Second thing is we are going to be putting that component in a router. Third thing is we are going to be applying the right. So these are the three things that we're going to be doing, right? So let me repeat what I'm going to do. Firstly, I'm going to be creating a component called, let's say, students list. And in the student list, I'm going to be putting the component, and I'm going to be making a call to the API. And in that API call, I'm going to be basically rendering that once things are available. At the same time, I'm also going to be creating and making use of deferrable directive in the Angular template, right? So without further ado, let me quickly start the code editor, and then I'll take you to the code editor and let me start coding for this particular use case, right? So let me just close everything, and please note that I have already saved everything over here. There's just one particular change, as you can see on my GitHub, but other things are committed and the record looks clean. So let me close this down, and what I'm going to do is like I'm going to be basically creating a component. Generate component, students list. Let's just create this. The component gets created here, and here is the student list. I'm just going to be writing my component, right? But before that, I also want to create a placeholder at the router. So here, let me open the app route.ts, and you can see that the dashboard module, it loads, and within the dashboard module, which is here, I'm going to be putting one object here for students list, right? So this is done. Now let me close this thing, and also what I'm going to do is like until I work on student list, I want to disable the auth card, right? The reason why I want to disable the auth card is because, let's say, if you do not disable it, and you will have to re-log in every time you make a change, and that's something which we do not want. So let me just disable this bit, which is at the line number 14, and then I'll come back to it once the application is ready, and then we will load it, right? So now again, let me take you back to the browser, and here the browser, you would notice, then I'm going to be opening the dashboard route, right? So now you can see that the dashboard route opens up, and I'm going to be opening student list, right? So right now there is nothing in the student list, but in the console also there's no error as such. It's just the blank component that it loads. So let me go back to code editor and write down something over here, right? And let me take you back to the browser, and there you go. Now you can see that the student list component loads. And also I think I need to create a bookmark here. I need to create a link over here so that user can actually click on it and go there, right? So let me clean this and go back to the code editor. There at the code editor, I'm going to be putting this in the sidebar. So let me open the sidebar, and head to the sidebar. This is the div. I'm just going to be making a copy of it. Let me put list only, right? All right. So this bit is done. Student list active. Fine. Now we have made the changes. Let me close down everything over here and open just the student list. Now I will the student list. The idea here is that I'm going to be displaying a lot many cards, and each card will basically house an image, student details, and all of those cards we would load gradually, right? And once we load gradually, we will also try to see how deferrable views really work. So now I'm going to be creating the student list first. So in order to create the student list, I'll have to first of all create the constructor. And then in the constructor, I'm going to be importing a dependency, which is basically a dashboard service. And using this dashboard service, I'm going to be basically making a call. Students, and then I'm going to be declaring this particular variable here. And now I'm going to be creating a template. So in this template, I'll first of all create a for loop. And within that for loop, I'm going to be basically making this template. So I'm going to be doing it like student of students. And then this is going to be a track, but let me do it this way. Let's do it this way, right? And once this is done, I'm going to be displaying the name and the age. And let me write it down, this one in H1. Right, I'm going to be defining the student style in a moment, but for now, let's just go ahead with this. And okay, now I'll quickly take you back to the browser. And in the browser, I'm going to be running this particular application to see how it works. So refresh this. Looks like something is not right. So let me go back to editor. And in the editor, let me write debugging. Let me also stop this. I just wait for a moment until this code is being killed. And let me refresh this and go back to browser and refresh this page as well. Something is not right. So now if you notice that we have written a component like this, and the problem why the data is not being shown on the template is because that zoneless change detection. And in case if you're doing a zoneless change detection, the first thing that it requires is basically to have the on push strategy. Otherwise, let me take you back to the code browser, and here in the code browser, I'm going to be opening a documentation of Angular. So zoneless, if you come further down, you would realize that requirement for zoneless compatibility, it lists down these 4 things, right? So let's just read this out. So the first thing is that change detection ref.mark for change call automatically by async pipe. Component ref.set input, updating a signal that's read in template, bound host or template listener callback, attaching a view that was marked dirty by one of the above, right? So if you further look down, you would see that the on push compatible components, one way to ensure that component is using a correct notification mechanism for above to use is change detection strategy dot on push, right? The on push change detection strategy is not required, but it is recommended a step forward towards zoneless compatibility. For application component, it is not always possible for library component to use on push strategy. When a library component is host for users component, you might use default. It cannot use on push because that would prevent the child component from being refreshed if it is not on push. Compatibility relies on zone.js to trigger change detection. Components can use default strategy as long as they notify Angular when change detection needs to run, calling mark for check or using signals async pipe, etc. Right? It tells you either to use on push or use any one of these methods to basically sync the data on your template, right? So now let me go back to code editor. So here is the code editor. Here is the template that we are trying to basically render. There are 2 ways to do it. First is I could actually import the change detector ref and then do a mark for check or detect changes or something like that. Or otherwise there is another way, which is basically to make this as an observable, and then do a dot next in order to send the data to the template. And when I do the dot next, I'll have to just use the async pipe, as it is one of the recommended method for synchronizing the data with the template and TS file. So let me do the other way, which is basically using behavior subject and doing a dot next in order to sync the data. Make it this way, and let me put a dollar right here, save it. And what I'm going to do is, like, I'm going to be running dot next method, basically students. And then once you're done with this, we'll go to the HTML template, and then let's implement the pipe. So it looks like this pipe is not here, so let me import this. Oh, you already have the imports available at the top. Okay, so let me utilize this one. All right, so what I'm going to do is, like, I'll also implement the on push strategy. All right, so now I've made it as dot next, and right, so I have also done the template level changes. Now let me take you back to the code web browser, and there you go. Now you can see that all the details regarding a student has arrived here on the template, right? And then now it's a time for us to implement the defer keyword, right? So let me just look at the data structure. Okay, images, country names in. All right, understand that. Again, I'll take you back to the Angular documentation where the deferrable views were defined, right? So there are 4 sections in this. You can see that image optimization, server side rendering, build time, pre-rendering, hydration. And in these 4 categories, there are these things that it talks about, right? So let's just go one after the other on all of these topics, all of these points. We will touch upon all these points, and then I'll try to explain each one of these in detail, right? So all right, so now let's talk about deferrable views. So deferrable views, there are basically multiple points in it. If you can look at the documentation, it talks about, how the block is used, what are triggers, prefetching, testing, behaviors with server-side rendering, behavior with ng modules, and so on and so forth, right? So now in this tutorial, what I'm going to do is, like, I'll touch upon all these topics one after the other, and I will only implement the most important one. So first thing first, why use deferrable views? So deferrable views, also known as defer block, and this is a real powerful tool that can be used to reduce the initial bundle size of your application or defer heavy component that may not ever be loaded until the later time, right? This should result in faster initial load and improvement in your code web vitals, CWV. Deferring some of your component until later should specifically improve largest contentful paint and time to first byte, TTFP and LCP. So this is something that we are going to be looking at this moment. But then there is another important aspect to it, which dependencies are defer loadable, meaning that not all the components that you have in Angular can be loaded using the deferrable. So there are certain prerequisite in order to load those dependencies in your web page, which can be loaded using a defer keyword. Is the first of which is that your component has to be standalone. So non-standalone components are still not supported by the deferrable views. The other thing is that they must not be directly referenced from the same file outside of defer block. This includes view child query, right? So let's say, for example, if you have a defer block inside there, which you have a view child query, and then you are trying to do something, then again, this defer loadable condition will not apply to them, and then those are not defer loadable, right? Now considering these 2 points, and then we have other views as well, which is like blocks, and then that's something which I'll come to a little while later, but let's just fix these 2 things, right? So in order to implement this, let me take you back to the code editor and write down the first defer keyword, right? So how do we define it? It's fairly simple. You just have to write down @defer, and then Let me do it this way, and then here. Okay, so now I'm going to be putting a placeholder, and that's something which I'll explain a little while later. So yeah, let me do it this way. Okay, so if you look at it closely, what it really does is that it says, in case while this particular block is deferred, the placeholder will be displayed in this location, right? So you may have noticed while loading the Google, while doing the Google image searches, that the block appears first, and post that comes the data, right? So let me just show you once. So let me just go to the browser, and here in the browser I'll just do a Google search. All right, so here in the browser, what I'm going to do is like I'll be searching something on the browser, and then we will do an infinite scroll. While we do the infinite scroll, you would notice that there are some images that would appear at a later time. However, the block for those appear at the first, right? So what I'm going to do for this is, like, let's say I'm going to be searching the country name, or the state where I live in. So let's say Rajasthan. So let me do images, and if you notice, for a fraction of a second, or let me do a throttle for this, right? So let's say inspect and network slow 3G, right? So now do a refresh, and then probably it'll be much more visible. Now you see there's a empty block that appears, and post that appears the image, right? So this is what exactly the effect that we are going to be mimicking at this moment. In case of a placeholder, I can actually define, there are some properties that I can define in placeholder, such as minimum. So in this case, what really happens is that the placeholder would appear at least for 500 milliseconds. So in our case, we are going to be doing something similar. So let me take you back to the code editor, and here at the code editor, I'm going to be writing the placeholder and giving it the conditions between it. So the play minimum time I need is, let's say, 300 2000 milliseconds. So which means that it'll at least appear for 2 seconds, right? And after that, the data loads on your screen. Okay, so to test it, I'll take you back to the browser, and I'll do a refresh, and there you go. So now you see that it all appears as loading, and then once data is available, the entire thing loads just the way it is right now, right? Now again, I'll take you back to the code editor, and we'll do a few more changes, and then we will try to wrap up the defer things, right? So as we've seen just recently, that the placeholder is basically to display the data while your data loads, right? What is that you really wish to be displaying while the data is being fetched in the. Now I'm going to be looking at the other properties. So the property age doesn't really exist in that response, right? So the property which exists is, let me just quickly have a look at the student response. So there is this chemistry, country, name, maths, physics, state, and things like that, right? So let me just put name, and then do, let's say, country, and save it, right? So now it's fine. I think we're pretty much sorted here, and I could actually display a GIF as well here in the div line number 13 I'm talking about. Okay, so what would happen really, that in case if you want to animate that such that, and also note that this particular block of code would be shown at least for 2000 milliseconds, which is basically 2 seconds, right? So now let me take you back to the code editor, or rather let me take you back to the student details web page, and let me open this, or rather let me open the dashboard, because we have removed the router guard completely. So let's see if the console has any error. So our looks good. Let me remove this and click here on list, and there you go. Now you can see that it took about a moment, and then it displayed all these images right here, right? So let's just see in the network tab, and let's see what was the image. That's the student image property, right? So let me take you back to the code editor. And if you notice that we had written only the image, it has to be student image, right? So this is done. Now let me define the height and width as well. Let me remove all these because we have not really defined any class just yet. Also, if you notice that I've made a small mistake, and this image is basically a property, right? So it has to be defined in this way, meaning it has to be interpolated the runtime. So yep, that's it. And now let me save it and take you back to the browser, and there you go. So here now you may notice that it shows up for about 2 seconds, and then it displays the name of the student and the country that the student comes from, and then the image of the student, right? Or the avatar of the student. And if the student hasn't defined an image or has displayed these kind of a character, that's what it will be shown. So if you look here, that's what it says. And let me just refresh and show you something. So here in this case, you may notice that when the loader was shown for about 2 seconds, please note that I've been adding these images. I've been adding these images runtime, and these are generated randomly. So there is no control over what images are being shown here. That's what I've been using. I've been using Faker and JSON server, and that's precisely the reason why I can't control the images, though I can, but then I do not wish to, right? So I'm just rendering all the images that comes from the API response, and an API response is something that you can see from here. So like if you look at here, there are 19 records that comes back, and each record has these many properties. So you can make use of these properties to display images, name, and the country that the student comes from. Now I'll take you back to code editor. So in code editor, now we may notice that entire application is, we have deferred a block, and then used a placeholder. There are multiple other options in the deferrable views that we can make a use of, and for that I'll have to take you back to the browser and I'll show you some. Right, so now we understand what defer is all about. Defer is about basically changing the priority at which user browser would be loaded with the content that we are shipping up, right? So now defer block we have already spoken about. We have spoken about placeholder. We have also spoken about the error, and then this loading is something similar to loading is pretty much similar to placeholder, with just one difference, which is when you give a placeholder, you can either give a placeholder or loading. So there is just one difference between loading and placeholder, when you can first of all either give loading or placeholder. And when you do loading, what it really does is that it does not really in case of a loading, it basically shows what needs to be shown at that particular block. Like the way we have done in our case was that we had defined a div in which we had defined the height and width. But in case if you're using the @loading, so in that case you will have to define the image or anything that you wish to show to the user while the data is being loaded in the background. An error is something which is an error block that you can pretty much display anywhere, right? So that's pretty much done. And now what I would do is like I'll go to the triggers, and which is a very important part. So we'll talk about triggers, and I'll show you some of the examples, right? So what do you understand by trigger? By the name itself, we can understand that it means that when a certain condition is fulfilled, it is going to be triggering certain things, right? So what do you mean by certain condition? So in that particular case, let's just quickly look at the condition listed by Angular, right? So on idle, on viewport, on interaction, on hover, on immediate, on timer, and so forth. On timer, right? So precisely 1, 2, 3, the precisely 6 condition that it talks about, right? So when you say on idle, it basically means that let's say if once your browser has reached an idle state, this is when the default behavior this is when this particular block would be triggered. Please understand, idle is not essentially idle, meaning idle does not really mean that when your application has to go idle. What it really does is that it does call the request ID idle callback, so which is basically a browser API, and using that browser API to understand that the browser has reached the idle stage only when this particular block would be triggered. on viewport. So in case of an on viewport, what really happens is, let's say if you scroll to a particular page. So viewport, I hope each and every one of you understand, and if not, then I'll give you a quick gist of what viewport is all about. So the viewing window of any web page is called viewport. It's like in this case, so let me go to the console and I'll quickly give you an example, right? So visual viewport. So like if you come here, then it says 1217.5 pixel is the height and the width is 1021.5. So now if you can notice the top of the page while I'm scrolling the page or extending the page, the height and the width changes, or at least the width changes, and height also gets changes if I try to do it like this. Now if I do this, then you would notice that the height and the width of a particular page has changed. So height has become 1362 and the width has become 1892, right? So viewport essentially means that anything between the address bar and the bottom of the page, anything a user can see at one glance is called a viewport. So in this particular case, the height is 1362 as you can see, and the width is 8892.5 pixel, right? So this is a viewport. So in case if you are using a trigger which talks about on viewport, what it essentially means is that whenever a particular page, and if a user scrolls and reaches to a particular page height width, that's when that's when the template of that particular page would be loaded. So it is a very essential aspect. So now if you it is basically used in finite scroll. So if I were to give you an example, I'll again open another web browser and then let me open the inspect. And firstly, in order to mimic it, I'll first of all have to show you the I'll have to show you I have to first of all do this in the slow 3G, and let's just try to do this, right? So now I will search city name I live in. So I'll do a search, and then once search is loaded, I'll take you to the images, right? So here in the images, if you notice that you can see that the images are being loaded and the scroll bar only appears till this point, and after that the scroll bar becomes again shorter, which means that the data has become available in the bottom. So right, so this is how the infinite scroll works. So the idea behind using that particular trigger, which is basically on viewport, is to basically save the bandwidth such that the details which are required to be shown in that here, let's say the bottom of the page or bottom of 2 or 3 scrolls or 2 times the viewport may not be needed immediately. Only that thing would be needed only when user scrolls down to that particular piece of page, right? So but then if a user is only hovering over the top, those are not treated. So that is why we use such kind of triggers, right? Earlier, before deferrable views, people used to do that using a core HTML and JavaScript thing, but now there is this thing called intersection observer. Okay, so I'll give you a quick gist of what I'm talking about. So there are certain observer, right? So if you open observers API, so there are multiple observer API available within the scope of JavaScript, right? So one of which is an intersection observer. So intersection observer is essentially the same, meaning the moment you like if you were to implement the same thing without the use of a defer keyword, meaning if you are using outside the scope of an Angular, then perhaps you will have to go with the intersection observer API, which does the same thing. But I'm not going to be explaining what intersection observer API is. But then I'll certainly give you a link of the MD and documentation. Please do read it in case if you want to know more about it. And then this particular thing, which is viewport, is basically a mimic. Is basically going to mimic the same behavior of intersection observer, right? So this is how it will work. Now what we'll do is like we'll start implementing this, and then we'll see that what are the other triggers that we can implement and see. We can implement and check. But for the viewport, let me take you back to the code editor. So here in the code editor, now you can see that this is how we have been loading this page, right? Meaning in the top level, we have one defer and then a placeholder. So what I'm going to do is like, I'm going to be modifying this piece of code a little bit, right? So let me do it this way. And then what I'm going to do is like, I'm going to be putting this another defer block. and I'm going to be writing the condition. And then please note, whenever you are writing the viewport, you must always define a placeholder, right? So define a placeholder, and then in case of placeholder, that basically it starts with at the rate. So placeholder, this is done, and now we're going to be putting this in the top, right? So this is done, and then on viewport, the placeholder here is the place where we can give minimum. And yep, let me save this. So now what we've essentially done is that we have defined the defer such that the placeholder will be shown until between line number 3 and 9 is defined. So this placeholder will be shown at least for 2000 milliseconds, and also this defer would work only when this particular block of code appears in the viewport. So now just let's test this. So let me take you back to the browser, and here in the browser, what I'm going to do is like I'm just going to be refreshing this page once again. If I refresh this page, yep, for 2 seconds, and then it appears, right? So now here, if you look at the network, right, and I'm just going to be clearing this bit, and as and when I start scrolling, you would notice that the API calls for these particular images are made, and that's how they get it, right? So now you can see that as and when I started scrolling, it started to load. And how did it happen? It happened because of the defer on viewport and a placeholder for 2000 milliseconds code was written, right? So that's how triggers work. So triggers, I believe that you maybe good enough to understand that you know what triggers are. So we have spoken about a few triggers, which is on idle, on viewport. Now we can talk about on interaction, on hover, on immediate, and on timer. So if you look at all of these triggers, they are very much self-explanatory, and you can just read by them, read about it, and then can basically make use of these. So now here in the viewport also you can see that it is part of an intersection observer. So further going down, you have an option of viewport greeting, in which case whenever the greeting div is appeared in the viewport, and that's when the loading would occur, right? On interaction is also one of the type, and on hover and on immediate and on timer and so on and so forth, right? So that's how it works essentially. So now in the next part, we're going to be talking about prefetching, right? So what is prefetching and why it is important? So let's just talk about prefetching. And before I talk about prefetching, I just want to recap on what we have discussed so far, right? So up until now, we have spoken about deferrable views. We have also spoken about the dependencies of deferrable. We've also spoken about multiple blocks, which is defer, placeholder, loading, and arrow. So in case of defer, you need a placeholder meaning until the defer block is loaded, the placeholder will be shown, and same goes with loading. So in case of loading, the loading part would be shown until the API call is made, and then the object is, and then the content for that particular piece of code is made available, and then error is shown only when the error occurs in the API call, right? In case of triggers, what really happens is that triggers basically waits for these triggers are basically used in connection. Triggers are basically used with the block. So you can use it with defer, you can use it with placeholder, loading, errors. So we spoke about six of those: on idle, on viewport. On viewport, we have also seen how it really works when the application is made available. So on when the application appears on viewport, that's when it started to load, and we have just seen that a moment ago. And on hover, similarly, on hover and on immediate and on timer is also something that you can make use of, right, by just doing and implementing this in various different blocks. Now the next topic we are going to be covering is prefetching, and then we'll talk about the other remaining stuff. So what is prefetching? So here, if you look at prefetching, let's just read this out clearly, and then I'll explain what prefetching is all about. So defer allows to specify conditions when prefetching of a dependency should be triggered. You can use a special prefetch keyword. A prefetch syntax works similar to the main defer condition and accepts when and slash or on the declared trigger. In this case, when and on associated with the defer control when to render, and the prefetch on controls when to fetch the resources, right? This enables more advanced behaviors such as letting you start to prefetch resources before a user has actually seen or interacted with the defer block, but might interact with it soon, making the resources available faster. In this example, below prefetching starts when a browser becomes idle and content of the block is rendered on the interaction. Let me just take you back to the VS Code. And here are the VS Code. You can see that I have already defined a defer. So let me change the defer for the trigger on interaction. And along with the on interaction, I'm going to be putting a prefetch on idle. So now you can see at line number 3, I have deferred it until the interaction is start, and I'm going to be prefetching it on idle, right? So now I'll take you back to the browser and I'll try to show you the behavior of this particular piece, right? So now you can see, let me refresh this and do a refresh once again, right? So let's see if now you can see that the um, the image and the text loads as soon as you start interacting with it. As in, when I'm clicking on it, that's how it is loading the image and the text inside it, right? So on interaction works, and I think that the placeholder with 2000 milliseconds doesn't really make any sense anymore. So I think I can remove this piece of code right here. So now I think this is good. Let me just do it this way on viewport. And let me take you back to the browser. And here, let me do a refresh. So idle normally occurs as soon as browser finish loading all the assets. That's immediately after which the idle callback would be triggered, right? So the idle callback is also something which is triggered in Angular using through. All right. So now we have covered prefetching. We have also covered the triggers, the blocks, and all the other deferrable views. So the last thing that we're going to talk about is testing, and then comes the behavior with server-side rendering and also static side generation. That's something which is not really something that I've covered so far, but SSR, or also known as server-side rendering, is a very important topic. Okay, so let's say if you wish to know more about what server-side rendering is, so please do write in the comment section below, and probably I'll cover the placeholder and its usage in the server-side rendering whenever, if there is a demand and if you really need it. But for now, I think we are pretty much good. We've understood all the important aspect of of the deferrable views. We've seen how defer works. We have also seen how trigger works, and by using these triggers and blocks, one can very well improve the performance of the application. But before we go any further, I would want to bring your attention to something else as well, right? So if you notice, initially at the start of the deferrable views chapter, I've briefly spoken about what impact does trigger prefetching, a placeholder loading, and error bring to the table. So now what I'm going to do is, like, I'm basically going to be, I've already created a student list. So and we have seen how defer, placeholder, and for loop works in it. So now I'm going to be making use of this particular student list component, another component, and I'll try to control its loading and unloading using a prefetch, using a defer, and prefetch. So using a defer, and we'll see that how it impacts the bundle size and other web vitals. So that's something which is coming up next. So I'll quickly take you back to the code editor, and here at the code editor, what I'm going to do is, like, I'll just clean up this bit of code. Let me remove this. Let me also remove this. Right. And let's say I wanna now in one of the component, right? So we'll see where. So student record, and I think okay, let me take you to the code browser, and from there we will determine where to place this. So here are the student details. You have a subject here, and you have a student here, which is a grid, and then the home, right? So what I'm going to do is like I think let me try putting that in the subjects tab, the list over here, right? So what I will do is like I'll basically try to create a button here, and then using that button I'll try to load this list page, right? And also while we do so, we will notice how the bundle is getting generated when we do the production build, and also we'll see how it is loading, right? So let me take you back to the code editor, and now we will start coding for this. Okay, so we had created a student list component just like that, and we were basically controlling it from the side navigation, which is list. So let's just do this. With the student list, instead of loading the student list, I'll load another component. That the component will basically try to manipulate the student list based on the blocks that we have seen in the previous in a few minutes ago, which is at the rate defer, at the rate placeholder, at the rate error, and at the rate prefetch, right? So but before that, let's just try to create another component over here. So let me move in here and also try to create a component. List placeholder component. So let's open the list placeholder, and this is the component I'm going to be keeping inside the list page. So let's just copy this and go here, the dashboard module, and let me put this here. Let me try to import this. Let's save this and open the list page again. And here I'm going to be putting the student list placeholder, right? So what I'm going to do is like I'll put the defer first, and then in the defer I'll also put the placeholder. So let's just do this. But instead of this, I'm not going to be importing the student list component. Okay, let's just place this here. Right, and then I'm going to be importing this here. So let's just import this here, which is right. And now what I'm going to do is like I'll just put this as lazily loaded, and then the placeholder is I'm going to be defining as a div, and inside that I'll write down some code which will just say that the component is about to load. Let's just save this and also display this for at least a few seconds, minimum, let's say 3 seconds. And then defer, let's just do the defer on idle. Oh yeah, so there is no colon here. Let's just remove this. Yep. And I think we are pretty much good. So we will see that how it really generates, and we'll also see how it really functions at this stage when the student details component is a separate component, and the list page only renders the list placeholder, and the placeholder will eventually call the student detail list component, right? So let's just go back to browser, and from the browser we'll try to see how it functions. So let's go here and do a refresh. Let me just close this down. And there you go. So there is this different chunk which gets created. If you notice over here, chunk F2VWIOSV. And now this is an important topic. Now this is an important aspect of it, right? So let's just refresh this and once again and see how many files are getting generated. So here, this is something which is getting generated on its own. And then this particular chunk is loaded after 2 seconds mark, after 3 seconds mark. Now let me take you back to code editor, and then the code editor, I'm going to be basically building this application, and let's see how it works. So let's just delete everything from the dist. So move to dash. Let me do a build. npm run start, and npm run build is the command. And let's see how the building process goes. Now there is the catch. Now if you look closely over here, the style chunk polyfill in the main.js files gets created, and lazy chunk files, it says that it has created 3. The one of which is a dashboard module, the other one is a student list component, and there is another chunk over here, right? So if you notice clearly here, the dashboard module is the module which we load lazily after the login button. And that's probably the reason why dashboard module is being loaded lazily. That's the reason why it is being built in a separate chunk file. And if you look closely over here, the second line states that student list component is also something which is loaded lazily, and chunk of which is chunk-l2bh6dpn.js, right? So this is the chunk which gets generated for your list component. Now let's just do another thing. Let me go back to the list placeholder component over here, and in the dashboard module, instead of defining this, I'll just define the older component once again, which was student list component, right? So let's come here and do this, right? And let me try to build this once again. Now, if you closely look at it, it says that the dashboard module is the only lazily loaded chunk file which is getting generated. It has not really created the other component, which is a student list component. And why is that so? Because we have kept the @defer in the previous build, and this time around we are not doing it. We are directly loading the component, which is basically you making use of defer and the other placeholder and triggers that we have seen previously. So that is the reason why this particular file is not getting generated, which was getting generated earlier. Right now, I think it's pretty much clear that why, how. So when we do anything like this, right? So obviously, yeah, it has made one of your component loaded lazily. And let me just revert this change. And once we revert this change and try to build this again, and we'll there you go. So again, if you notice that student list component was getting generated separately, and while it was getting generated separately, when you load it in the browser, that's why it'll be better. All right, so now we are going to be testing this particular feature, and let me just go back to the browser and do a refresh, and I'll show you that a different chunk is getting generated. Okay, so let me go back to browser and do a refresh once again, because now we have changed the component back to list placeholder component. So let's just refresh this. See, it says for about 3 seconds, and then it loads all of your component. And all of these components are getting loaded as and when they come in viewport. And you probably would have noticed all these image files are being called from the HTTP from the template as and when they appear on the viewport. Now let me go back to the top of the page and shuffle between these components once again. So there you go. So here, if you notice in the top, this was the bundle which got generated for this lazily loaded component, and now we will try to see if it really brings any value in your page performance or not. So in order to do this right, so what I'm going to do is, like, I'm going to be recording this particular thing here. So let me do a refresh. So now let me do it this way, or rather, okay, so let's just do it this way. So DOM content loaded was fired at 98.88 millisecond. The load event fire at 95.31 milliseconds. mark, right? So now let's see when the first paint occurred. It occurred at 146.49 milliseconds, and similarly FCP occurred at 146.49 milliseconds, right? Now let me refresh this once again and go back to browser and try to put this back in a way in which we don't make use of a defer in case of loading this particular component lazily. So Control Z, save this. Now go back to browser and let's try to see this. So again, I'm going to be recording this particular thing. So let's just do a refresh. Now you can see that it has taken a little more extra time, right? So in 159.60 FP, the FCP is 159.60, and the last contentful page was 182.53, and the load fired at 107.22 milliseconds, right? So it's obviously since we are running this application in a dev mode, we're not really using the production, and I'm not going to be testing it in the production, but then it is good enough to give you a gist of what is that we are trying to achieve, right? So just to recap, I'll go back to code editor and I'll try to do that once again. So let me put this component once again down below and go back to browser and remove this and do a search again. It's a clear win. Now you can see that the DOM content loaded fired at 95.13 millisecond, and your load event fired at 95.4 milliseconds, and first paint fired at 146.15 millisecond, and contentful paint C is roughly at 146 milliseconds, right? So now we have seen by using these deferrable views, we can improve the performance of your application. We have seen that how when we started using defer for a particular component, how it started to improve the performance. So if you look at this particular documentation, and whenever you have a large page designed wherein you want to manipulate with the performance, I would suggest you to start using these deferrable views, right? So these are pretty awesome. These are pretty awesome way to improve the application performance. So thanks a lot, ladies and gentlemen, and then by this I want to end this tutorial. And thanks a lot, ladies and gentlemen, for listening in. And if you haven't really subscribed to my channel, please do so. It's an humble request. And then if you feel that I need to focus on a certain aspect of Angular, or if you want to know more about any other topic, please do write down in the comment section below. I'll be more than happy to create separate video tutorial around it. So thanks a lot, ladies and gentlemen, once again, and I'll see you in the next one, wherein we would cover the next topic, which was released by Angular 18, which is built-in control flow are more stable. So that's something we are going to be covering in the next tutorial. For now, and for this particular tutorial, I think we are pretty much done. So thanks a lot once again, ladies and gentlemen. I'll see you in the next one.